Hey, U.S. history students, today we're moving into the modern era. This era is going to be 1968 through 2009. And so today we're going to be talking about Richard Nixon and the Nixon administration. As you know, for most of the 1960s, the Democrats had held the White House. It was JFK and LBJ. And so they used bigger government to try to solve problems. Now Nixon won the election in 1968, and he's a Republican. He's going to move the nation in a more conservative direction, and he's going to eliminate a lot of Johnson's Great Society programs. So he determined that the states needed to have the money to determine what they wanted to do instead of having the federal government determine what it wanted to do. So he put an end to the draft. He was tough on crime, and he even created environmental laws. Yes, a Republican creating environmental laws. Major court case that came out of this era that we have talked about before, it's Tinker versus Des Moines. As you know, Tinker and his sister wore these black armbands to school to protest the Vietnam War, and they refused to take them off when the administration asked them to, and so they were suspended. And so they took their case to court, and the Supreme Court ultimately ruled that the students' First Amendment rights to free speech were violated. They're allowed to speak and use their free speech rights as long as it does not obstruct the educational process. One of the big problems at home in America facing Nixon during his presidency and other presidents during the 70s, including Ford and Carter, was inflation. So rising prices, rising unemployment. Nixon does several things to try to fix these problems. He cuts spending on social programs, takes the United States off the gold standard. He imposes wage and price controls, but none of these attempts were successful, and inflation continued to rise through the 1970s. And this will be a problem that Ford and Carter, the next two presidents, would have to deal with as well. Two of the major laws that Nixon passed during his term as president affected the environment. So he creates the Environmental Protection Agency with a law, which they set air and water pollution standards for cities. They monitor and enforce environmental laws. They try to make sure that companies, businesses, people are not polluting to an excessive amount. And then he also creates the Endangered Species Act, which required Fish and Wildlife to list species that are threatened to extinction and then try to protect those species. So two environmental laws Nixon passes in the early 1970s. The next thing that happened under the Nixon administration here at home was Congress passing the Equal Rights Amendment, or ERA. Now, the roots of this go back to the early 20s when there's a lady named Alice Paul who proposed this amendment, which would give women equal rights under constitutional law. It would say that equality of rights cannot be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. Now, it was introduced and passed in 1972, but an amendment has to be passed by the states, and so they needed 38 states to ratify it, but only 35 did, so it did not pass. It has been introduced into Congress since then, but it has not been passed by Congress. Now, one of the main leaders that fought against this was Phyllis Schlafly. She's an outspoken critic of the women's liberation movement and of the ERA, so a woman that's against certain women's rights, because she believed that the ERA would reduce the rights of wives and harm family life, and claimed that the ERA would deprive women of the right to be supported and protected by men. She also used the claim that it would create unisex bathrooms and would have women being drafted and serving in combat roles in the military. Okay, on to some foreign policy issues in the Nixon administration. You've got China. So remember, China turned into a communist country 1949. Since then, the U.S. had refused to recognize that government as the legitimate government because they were communists. We didn't want to recognize them as legit. But in the 70s, early 70s, we're in the Vietnam War, fighting North Vietnam, and so Nixon wants to put pressure on North Vietnam by creating a relationship with China, who's also communist, and they kind of speak to North Vietnam on America's behalf. And so Nixon restores diplomatic relations with Communist China in 1972 and becomes the first American president to visit the mainland China. And he looks like he's really enjoying his Chinese food there. And then, as far as with the Soviets, this moves into an area called détente. Detente means relaxing of tension or cooperation. And so under Nixon, the United States and the Soviets kind of eased tensions a little bit, and try to move into an era of peaceful coexistence. So detente is going to replace the hostility of the Cold War, and the two countries are going to enjoy peaceful relations for several years throughout the early and mid-'70s. 1972, you've got Nixon that actually visits Moscow, and then he signs SALT I, Strategic Arms Limitation Talks. It basically limits the development of nuclear missile systems, to try to reduce the amount of missiles in the world. The Nixon administration ran into some problems in 1973. Some corruption emerged. His vice president, right here, Spiro Agnew, resigned in 1973 when it came out that he had taken bribes while he was the governor of Maryland, and that he avoided paying his taxes. And so Agnew's out, and Nixon appointed the new vice president. His new vice president is going to be Gerald Ford. Now we're going to move into to talking about Nixon and what eventually led to his downfall and his resignation as president, the Watergate scandal. So it all goes back to Nixon's fear. So throughout his political career, Nixon, he always lived with this fear of losing elections. A lot of people think that it came down to the reason why is because he lost the 1960 election to JFK. But he wins in 68, and by 1972 re-election, Nixon is going to seek any advantages possible. He's going to try to win by any means. And Nixon won the 1972 election by an overwhelming majority, which just shows that he was fearful, oftentimes for no reason. So Nixon, keeping his enemies list in this political cartoon, here's Nixon, here's his list, his long list of all these people that he thinks are out to get him or that are his enemies, but remember, he is his own worst enemy because he's fearful for really no reason. Here's the 1972 election map. You can see that Nixon in the blue wins the majority of the country by an ultimate landslide. The Democrats only win 2 states, and the Libertarians win part of Virginia. So the Watergate issue, the scandal, is basically centered on Nixon, his administration, because they attempted to cover up a burglary that happened at the Democratic National Committee headquarters. Now, Nixon's obviously Republican, and there was a burglary at the Democratic National headquarters at the Watergate office and apartment complex in Washington, D.C., where they had their office. And this burglary took place in the middle of the night on June 17th of 1972. And so a guard at the Watergate Hotel, he basically caught burglars breaking in, called the police. The police came in, arrested the burglars, and they linked these burglars back to the Committee to Re-elect the President, or CRP, or CREEP. And so a massive cover-up ensued in Washington. Nixon was trying to cover up that he was involved at any point or that he knew about it. And he brought in a group of people to try to make the problem go away. They're nicknamed the plumbers because they try to fix problems. So the story kind of started to die a little bit maybe, but there was 2 reporters that worked for the Washington Post, the newspaper in Washington, D.C., and their reporters, Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein. They kept up with the stories, and in a series of articles, they kept unveiling reports that Nixon was involved somehow because they had an unnamed source that kept giving them information. Nixon denied being involved in any way. He even went on TV and talked to the nation and denied that he was trying to cover anything up or that he was involved whatsoever. So the burglars and those that were that could be proved they were involved, they're called the President's Men, and they went on trial. And as the trial went on, it kept looking more and more like Nixon was involved. And so Congress held a congressional hearing, and they discovered that Nixon taped almost all of his conversations. He taped his conversations because he wanted to go back and listen to them later, help him write his book, his memoir. And so Congress learned of this. So everyone wanted to know what was in the tapes. People were talking about impeaching the president, and so they tried to get the tapes, but Nixon did not want to give up the tapes. Finally, Nixon did release some tapes, an edited version of the tapes. He went on TV, told the nation he's not a crook, but but the version was edited. It was missing parts, it was missing things in it, conversations were cut out, and so the courts wanted the unedited version. And then on August 5th of 1974, Nixon released the tapes again, but there were still huge gaps in it. 18 and a half minutes had been erased from part of it. The tapes did not look good for Nixon. It revealed him to be petty and mean and vulgar. And on August 8th of 1974, Nixon resigned. He did not say he was guilty. He just said that some of his judgments had been wrong. And in total, for the whole Watergate scandal and related crimes, 25 men were indicted and convicted of crimes and spent time in prison. So the tapes that were given, they didn't offer proof that he had ordered the Watergate break-in. They did offer proof that he had been involved in the cover-up. But remember that 18 and a half minutes of the tapes are missing. We don't know what those tapes, what that section, that part says. But Nixon denied to his dying day that he did not order Watergate. In 2005, the source that gave information to the Washington Post actually came forward. His name was Mark Felt. He was 91 years of age in 2005, and in the 1970s he had been the number 2 man at the FBI, and so he was giving updates and information as they found it to the Washington Post. So now that Nixon resigns, Vice President becomes president, and we have Gerald Ford. Now the interesting thing about Gerald Ford is that, remember, he became vice president not because he was elected, because Agnew resigned and he was appointed by Nixon, and then now Nixon resigns and Gerald Ford becomes president. He was never elected to any position.